Good day. Welcome to this session of the UGC's E-Pathshala Postgraduate for the Architecture. This session is on air conditioning. Air conditioning is a very wide field, and today we will touch on the most basic requirement of air conditioning, namely ventilation. All of you, I am sure, are aware of ventilation. We all, we say this place is poorly ventilated, we say this place is well ventilated. But in specific terms, what we mean when we say that is that the exchange of outside air between inside is low if it is poor ventilation, is high if it is well ventilated. So in other words, ventilation implies the movement of outside air into the enclosed space which you are considering. Obviously, the basic requirement for any air conditioning is an enclosed space. Without an enclosure, there will be no air conditioning. So in an enclosure, you always need ambient air basically to control the indoor air quality for occupancy. Now, such being the case, the slide really gives you an idea of a basic enclosure which has openings and which can bring in air. Ventilation can be effected by two basic modes, one natural and the other obviously, I won't say artificial, I will call it mechanical. So it is either natural ventilation or mechanical ventilation. Natural ventilation again can be attained by two means. It can either be due to the prevalent wind or it can be due to stack. Stack obviously means up. Ventilation by wind is requiring perhaps no explanation. Now when you talk of ventilation by wind, it is basically a very simple requirement. It is like a ship sailing on the water. I mean a wind ship, a wind energy ship. You have a ship, you put on the sail, the bigger the sail, the faster the movement of the ship. Like that, in a space, if you have a window, the bigger the window, the larger will be the amount of air coming into it. The other factor will be the larger the velocity of the wind. If there is no wind, you might have absolutely an area, you might have a room without a particular wall, but if there is no wind, you will still have no ventilation. So in other words, as you see on your slide, you see an enclosure. Scientifically, we will say it has two openings. It has an air inlet opening AI and an air outlet opening AO, air outlet. And the wind comes into this opening only due to its natural velocity. That is natural velocity by wind effect. It is a function of the area of the window and the area and the velocity of the wind. Now, the area that you reckon in all these calculations is always the minimum of the two, A1, A0. For instance, you have a large air inlet window, but on the air outlet you just have a 1 by 1 opening. Then obviously the amount of air movement throughput will be governed by what was the outlet area. Vice versa, it would be the other way about. So the smaller of the two openings is taken into account and multiplied by the velocity in whatever units we are working on, feet per second, meters per second, and you get the total throughput of air. Books like Kennisberger's Tropical Planning are excellent books to read when looking at this subject. Kennisberger is an architect who spent a lot of time in Bangalore. He has made in his book certain observations and certain things which are extremely useful, extremely valid. Please don't overlook looking at them. They are relevant, excellent references. The other factor which affects natural ventilation is stack effect. Now this generally happens in industrial climates. Like for instance, on the slide you see a boiler. Its shed is generally a big shed, a tall shed. Now the moment you have a tall shed, the general tendency is to put louvers all over. That means louvers from the floor up to the ceiling. Now such louvers will depend entirely only on wind effect. Now supposing this boiler house is sited in the center of a plant where there is very little wind ambient on the windows, there is a factor like stack effect where one can play about. You build a shed, make it very tall, give it air openings at the floor level, give it air openings at the ceiling level. Then what would happen is the difference between outside, a high opening and a low opening will be very large. The room becomes warm. The moment this is warm, it balances itself with an air column outside, which is not warm, which is cold. The cold column is heavy. The light column, the inside hot column is light. The equalizer is at the bottom. There is an opening if you see in the slide. The moment this becomes light, obviously by law of nature, by law of gravity, this tries to go up and outside air tries to rush in through the lower openings. Now that is the stack effect. This is extremely useful for industrial buildings like boiler houses, cement plants, where occupancy is virtually zero. Lot of equipment is there, you have lot of heat, it starts moving, machinery starts moving, you build up heat, but you do not want a very good temperature. You do not look for 24 degrees for human comfort, you look for at a limit where the machine does not burn off, which is reasonably high. So in such places it is nice to look at a stack effect. As I mentioned in my talk earlier, the stack effect is a function of the temperature difference between the outside and inside, the level of the openings and the area of the openings. Now these two factors do not have to be either this or that. You could have a tall building, you could have partly natural effect of ventilation, you could partially have the other. So again, being natural elements, they are difficult to calculate the exactness, but they are, a shed designed with these parameters can be extremely useful to control temperatures to the requirement of internal equipment. May not be useful for control of environment to make it habitable for a person, not in tropics, but equipment definitely can be very well served by natural ventilation. This is a repeat of what I just mentioned, that natural ventilation can give you perhaps 1 or 2 air changes per hour, which is absolutely enough to maintain good oxygen levels, which is absolutely enough to maintain something like maybe indoor air quality, but perhaps not enough for thermal comfort, for which you might have to look at higher levels. Second thing is, there is a certain amount of legislation which has come in today, which blindly says that you should have a certain amount of air changes for an application. The National Building Code, for instance, will specify that stores, warehouses should have 8 air changes per hour. You might find a specification to say that you need for a workplace minimum 10 air changes per hour. Now such requirements cannot be met by natural ventilation. At that point of time, you have got to look for supplements like mechanical ventilation. What is mechanical ventilation? Mechanical ventilation is the same enclosure that you cannot get away from, but now that enclosure is married to a fan, as you can see on this slide. This fan can be installed in such a manner that it pulls in air into the space. It can be installed alternatively in such a manner that it pushes in air into the AC space, or you could have 2 fans, one pushing in and one pulling out. This is a very simple detail like one sees in any toilet. You go to a toilet, you find that there is a small exhaust fan throwing out air. That is called pull ventilation. Ideally for such an application, air inlet comes in from the door, the exhaust fan maintains the place at a negative pressure and throws out the air, vitiated air. Toilets are a very simple example of this, and a prime requirement is that the place should be reasonably airtight. Otherwise the fan will not create vacuum. There will be no air induction at the door. Supposing they were very opening very close to the fan, you will have that opening feeling the appetite of the fan, and the place will perhaps not be affected for ventilation at all. Now in the push ventilation, you have a little better control on the place where you are putting the air. Both are similar. Quantities of air to maintain a certain amount of air change will be the same size of fans. Now here schematically the fan pushes in the air and air escapes the enclosure by gravity. Now like in the other one where we have a combination of stack and wind effect, here you could have a combination of push and pull. Now this kind of ventilation system is ideal for industrial applications because it gives you a control on the internal pressures to be maintained. For instance, now supposing you are handling an acid laden atmosphere, you would like to keep the place at negative pressure, which means the amount of inlet air will be lower. The air pushed inside will be a little lower than the air pulled outside. That is when you place the place at negative pressure. So, the vitiated atmosphere inside the shed or enclosure does not proliferate outside. On the other hand, supposing you want positive, supposing you are sitting on, let us say, the middle of a road and you do not want the dust to get in and you want the inside to be positive pressure, then all you have got to do is push in more air, pull out less, make sure that the enclosure is at a little positive pressure compared to ambient, so that outside air does not come in when you open and close the doors. Now, among all this talk of 1 air change, 2 air change, 20 air changes, 10 air changes, there is one aspect which must always be remembered, that ventilation can never cool. I am talking of again an ambient from where I am addressing this session, hot and humid. In a hot and humid climate, if one expects that I add an exhaust fan either for air inlet or for air exhaust and my space temperature will come down, that will never happen, because basically you are moving ambient air into the enclosure, and ambient air is what it is hot, 40 degrees, and heat will never flow from a cooler media to a hotter media. So, heat will follow its laws of thermodynamics. It will only, the space temperature can at best only be warmer than the outside. The degree of warmth can be reduced by ventilation. It can be 1 degree warmer, it can be half a degree warmer, it can be 5 degree warmer, depending on the throughput of air that you give through the structure. Now, once you talk of air movement, you are talking of fan, you are talking of air movement. We have said one thing that it cannot do, it cannot control temperature. But the moment you have mechanical ventilation, you have an option of improving the cleanliness of air. You can add a filter on the fan, make it a fan and filter module, and you can influence its cleanliness. You were not able to influence its temperature, but its cleanliness is certainly controllable by proper filtration. Now, what is a filter? If I have an airstream like this, I put a string. That string is a filter, because it has a fair chance of a couple of particulates catching on the string. That string has become a filter, but its efficiency is very low because it got only a couple. But instead of that string, if I took out my handkerchief and spread it across, fine. Now what have I got? I have got a bigger surface area. It comes and impinges larger. Now its efficiency has improved. Compared to the string which had only 2 particles, this might have 200 particles. So this is a better filter. Basically, a filter is what? A filter is a fibrous media, as you can see. Generally, now you have various grades. Actually, I list 13 grades of filters. I will not get into that because it's too involved and it's not required for, let us say, a student of architecture. Not required even for, let us say, a normal air conditioning application. Thresholds that are defined today on filtration are basically 3, as you see on the slide in front of you. One is 10 micron, second is 5 micron, and third is 0.3 microns. Now, what is a micron? A micron is 10 to the power minus 6 of meters. 10 to the power of minus 6 of a meter is something which is very difficult. If I stretch my hands maybe a little beyond my screen, I will show you a meter, but I am sure all of us can imagine what a meter is. 10 to the power of minus 6, no, it will be very difficult to imagine. Let us look at another analogy. I pull out a hair, stretch it in front of an electron microscope and allow it to magnify. If it were magnified to, let us say, 10 inches, I take an A4 sheet and it comes 10 inches. My hair diameter looks like 10 inches on an electron microscope. On that electron microscope, if I take a 0.3 micron element and keep it, that would look like a 1 rupee coin, something like 1 inches compared to 10. That means 0.3 micron is something like 1/10 the diameter of my hair. So that is the kind of particulate matter that this HEPA filter which you see on your screen can filter. That is 0.3. 10 micron is obviously 30 times bigger, which is what you see in normal air conditioners. As I said, 10 micron filter is what you see on a normal air conditioner. This, in the slide that you have in front of you, you see a window air conditioner. The return air from the machine goes into the machine and it is filtered by a filter which is 10 microns. But definitely you and I today know that that is enough for the normal purposes. So a 10 micron filter is like what you see in a good air conditioned room. The next grade of better filters would be a 5 micron filter. Talk to the 10 micron filter. The efficiency that was associated with the commonly used 10 micron filter was about 50%. You will generally be able to hold up this filter to a light and you will be able to see through. Maybe you will be able to even discern the person who is across the filter from you. In a 5 micron filter that does not happen, because the 5 micron filter comes to you with an efficiency of 95% minimum and ideally 99%. The filter media is something like a few millimeters thick depending on the manufacturer, and this kind of filter obviously does that much of a better job, maybe about 70-80 times better than the other filter. It catches a smaller particulate and is generally used for less critical applications, like let us say an ICU in a hospital. In a hospital ICU you definitely use it, it is very useful, lovely. Now if that is enough and good, why does one need a 0.3 micron filter? The 0.3 micron filter becomes necessary to be able to hold on smaller particulates. Now what is the interest in smaller particulates for let us say a common man? Basically what happens is, if you go back to let us say medical science, it tells you that bacteria, virus today have no feet, no hands, they can't move. How do they move? They settle on dust particulates to be able to proliferate. Now if you are able to not catch a bacteria, if you are not able to catch a virus, since you know it is going to be traveling on dust, you catch dust. So in other words, it is an inverse way of infection control to be able to filter dust to the best extent that is possible economically and required. So in other words, you can have filtration to the best level of 0.3 micron at 99.9% efficiency. Using that would mean that you need a very powerful fan, because as I mentioned, the media which does the filtration becomes thicker and thicker, and by common sense you can feel that just like you would say a tea filter of a particular size requires a certain amount of liquid leg to be able to affect filtration. Here you need a fan static pressure to be able to affect the filtration. So if you notice in the earlier slides, you had seen something like a propeller fan being used for filters. Now these were all right for something like a 10 micron filter with 50% efficiency. But the moment the efficiency became bigger, you will notice that I very quietly switched the fan from a propeller fan to a centrifugal fan. I will talk about this a little later. So in other words, the fan becomes powerful, its HP goes up when you want the fan to do not only ventilation but filtration. When you use a 0.3 micron filter, the absolute filter as it is called, invariably it is so expensive that you try to protect it by using the 5 micron filter as a pre-filter, and you try to protect the 5 micron filter by using a 10 micron filter on the downstream side. So air first goes to the 10 micron filter, sheds all its bigger particles there, then moves inwards. So it has carrying now only what the earlier filter did not catch, the 5 micron filter. Those are shed on the pre-filter as we call it, and the final filter takes on the 0.3 micron dust. Generally the 10 micron and 5 micron filters are cleanable filters. That is why you resort to this, so that to control cost you could remove those filters, clean them and put it back, you are in business again. The last filter 0.3 micron generally is a throwaway filter. You protect it so that its life is extended as much as possible, and then when it becomes too dirty you just throw it away. Now in the earlier slide you saw the HEPA filter, the fine filter located in the air handling unit, right? It was in the machine. After the machine you had a certain portion of the unit and some ducting. Now that portion of duct which is closest to the air conditioned space or a ventilated space will have access to the duct. So, any dust, any vermin which might settle into the duct has a fair chance of getting into the air conditioned space. So, invariably what is done is you look at using HEPA filter as a terminal filter. Terminal in the sense that not fatality, terminal in the sense that it is used at the terminal of the air duct. So, you would have noticed that in this slide you see the HEPA filter moved right up to the point of entry into the space of interest. So, downstream, that means in the machine you might not have used the machine for a week, some vermin might have bred, it might have left some bacteria, virus, it does not matter because it will get caught on the terminal filter. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, the fans will slowly change. So, it is a little nice to have the type of varieties that you would have access to on fans. Basically again fans can be listed into two generic varieties, one an axial flow fan and one a centrifugal fan. The axial flow fan moves air along the axis of the fan. The shaft, air moves along it. Now, the most common example is our own ceiling fan. A ceiling fan is an axial flow fan. The shaft is vertical, air moves downward. So, that is an axial flow fan. Now, this is not capable of handling good filters. The moment you put a filter, you will find that the airstream comes down. Try it out. Spread a sheet across below your ceiling fan, you will find that no air comes below it. The fan did not have enough static pressure to be able to push the air through even a bed sheet. That means it will not have static pressure to push it through a filter. So, when you change from a propeller fan or an axial flow fan to a fan which requires filters, the next best thing you can do is to go in for a centrifugal fan. A centrifugal fan has more power. It uses the centrifugal force to make the airstream more powerful so that it can push its way through a filter. Now, these fans obviously consume a little more horsepower, but they are required for that kind of duty. Let us go back again to that ventilation. We were talking of ventilation at so many air changes, we did mention ventilation is required to maintain a proper IAQ. IAQ is indoor air quality. Now, that is required by you might say it is dictated by doctors and a new breed of people, the hygienists. A hygienist and a doctor decides what is the kind of fresh air that is required for people. ASHRAE has a very good ventilation standard, standard 52, which you are welcome to read, nice to know, but offhand it is enough to know that something like about 10 to 15 CFM in an office activity, clean environment, 10 CFM per person is more or less adequate. In an environment like a restaurant, the same person will require 15 CFM per person. Now, why did I make this jump from 10 to 15? That 5 CFM is required to counter the odor added by food. So, I want to dilute the odor, I want to dilute that pollution caused by the odor. What do? I put in 5 CFM extra, so that the air will feel a little more fresh. So, in other words, I have diluted to get rid of pollution. Now, as I mentioned, the two breeds of people who are very interested in this field of air quantity for ventilation are the air conditioning man, obviously because it affects his heat load, and the hygienist who is worried about your health. You have a proper air quantity, you get proper factors for air. Invariably, if you refer elsewhere, you will find that CO2 is used as a surrogate reference. You know, you cannot write out a book and say, oh, my air must contain this much of carbon monoxide, it must contain this much of. So, all pollutants are pushed into a surrogate reference, and CO2 is generally used as the reference. If air is vitiated for more than 1000 ppm of CO2, it is considered inadequate, unclean. The other factor one normally uses is it should be 600, it cannot be 600 more than ambient. For instance, if I come from the street and my street has a level of say 300, ideally the indoor air quality should be 900. That means I must bring in that much of fresh air, maybe 10 CFM per person, maybe 11 CFM per person, to ensure that the inside is fresh. Now, indoor air quality, when we were talking of it gets degraded by elements like particulates, by elements like gases, by elements like vapors. Particulates, very simply, you just catch them in a filter, they are trapped. Things like gaseous and vapors require special filtration. They require activated charcoal filters, they require gas absorbers. Now, that will not be within the ken of this talk, but knowing about these parameters and a requirement that they can impose upon you is nice to have. While we were talking of these pollutants, particulates, gases, vapors, it is nice to know their source before you want to exercise control on them. It is nice to know that even after you control them, will they get re-added to the space? Will they come back? How will you control them? That is what your outdoor air quality ventilation has been effected for. Now, once you try to look at IOQ and you know that it can get vitiated by the 3 elements we talked of earlier, and you are doing ventilation to basically control this, you start looking at it a little more scientifically. What are you looking at? You are looking at control. Of what? Something that is liberated in the space. Achoo! I sneezed. That's pollution. You saw me catch it in my hands. Did I do a good job? No. Now, will you be surprised if I tell you that what I liberated into the space will remain in suspension for 2 weeks in an air conditioned room? These aerosols will get together, they will go down because they are heavier. While going down, they will evaporate, become lighter, they will go up. They will never be able to make up their mind whether they should go down and settle or become lighter and settle. They will keep moving up and down, and in the process it takes 2 weeks. If a friend of mine were to come and sit here, I have a fair chance of passing on this to him unknowingly. Now, that was source. I was the source, and if I had to control it, what would have been the best? The best would have been to take out a handkerchief, catch it here, then I have done a duty. I have caught the pollution at the source. This is true of anything. You work at lathe, if it is polluting the atmosphere, put a unit collector on it. If there is a kitchen which is spewing smoke, put a hood on it. These are common things. I am just putting them in words. This was source control. Now, if you look at the other form of control, in certain parameters you cannot control source. Like for instance, wet mopping a floor. Now, the floor has been wet mopped. The moisture will be liberated all over. You cannot do anything. You cannot put a hood over every area that you mop. Now, that is allowed to come out. Then what do? You size your equipment in such a manner that it can handle that kind of humidity which is added on. There the pollution is humidity. Here the pollution was an aerosol liberated by a human body. Now, there are, after both these, as I said, there are certain things which you cannot catch, you cannot minimize. So, those things you live with them and effect dilution by putting in more fresh air. So, you could for instance say, look, my janitorial practice is in the morning at 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock I have humidity added on. So, technically a good air conditioning man can say, at the time my floors are being mopped, let me increase the fresh air by 10%. Let me increase my fresh air by 20%. It will mean a marginal increase in heat load, but a phenomenal improve in air quality. What will happen if you do not control? Very small things can happen. You might catch a cold. Like for instance, if I sneezed and I didn't exercise this control, what have I done? I have unnecessarily increased the risk of a friend of mine catching this. Now, that is a minor risk. In certain cases, what is liberated and not caught, not controlled, can lead to things like cancer. It can lead to even fatal things like what you saw in the Bhopal tragedy. Methyl isocyanate liberated, uncontrolled, caused death for miles, caused disaster for miles. Now, that is an extreme case. If laws had been available, if pollution control had been exercised, maybe there might have been a venue, a vehicle for trapping that pollutant. Today, nobody is allowed to store methyl isocyanate inside because they expect that you will never be able to control its damage pour out at some point of time. So, what do? You store it under a banyan tree. So, in case it comes out, there is absolutely a large amount of dilution expected, and you expect that dilution will be the answer to that pollution. The references that you can take for this are basically the American Institute of Hygienists. They have a wonderful book called Industrial Ventilation. It is more pictorial than written matter. A perusal of that will make you an excellent pollution control person, and pollution control, what I have talked of in these few minutes that I had with you, is something which is the subject of a master's degree, 2 full years. Pollution control, environmental protection, these things have become so important. What I thought I will do in these few minutes is to put this in your mind, to expect you to look into these books which are extremely good. The Industrial Ventilation by the ACGIH, which is the American Council of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, and of course the ASHRAE standards. Thank you very much.